Hi, my name is Rick Bloodworth. This is the Common Sense Christian Channel, and today I want to talk to you about an old friend of mine by the name of Kenneth Wood. Now, Kenneth has been gone for quite a number of years now, over 20 as a matter of fact, but I met him right after we moved to Happy, Texas. I was a brand new preacher, just fresh out of the box and ready to go. We moved at the end of October, and when we moved here, there was still some old grass that had just kind of gotten up. I think they call it Johnson grass here. Blue stem may be the right word for it. But anyway, that had to be knocked down. So I was out with my lawnmower trying to get it all mowed. And my lawnmower had a problem. It didn't run quite right. Well, I got a call after I was through with mowing from a man who introduced himself as Kenneth Wood. He said he lived across the alley from the church house and from the church, and he had heard that my lawnmower was having trouble. Well, my lawnmower was having trouble. That ethanol gas that you use in it isn't very kind towards these small engines, and it had gummed everything up. So I took the air cleaner off and I jammed a screwdriver into the carburetor. Well, I told Kenneth what I had done, and that kind of hurt his feelings because Kenneth told me that he was a lawnmower repairman and in fact had been for over 30 years. Well, everybody has their different occupation, and that's not all that unusual, but what was unusual about Kenneth Wood being a lawnmower repairman was that he was blind. And he had been blind since about the year 1960. So he had been, by the time I moved here in 1995, he had been just absolutely, totally blind. And the way he made a living was he worked on people's lawnmowers. Now, I always thought that was interesting because he could have just taken total disability, but if you knew Kenneth, you knew that that wasn't what he wanted to do. He wanted to be doing something. Well, and he hadn't always been blind. He was born probably in the late teens or early 20s, and he was just he was old school. He grew up during the Great Depression, making $1 a day, plowing for people, and as the years went by and his eyesight got a little bit worse, I never was really sure what was wrong with his eyes other than the fact it kind of sounded like a form of macular degeneration where it just kind of slowly went. And I remember my father-in-law and his brother talking about Kenneth plowing for them when he was a younger man. So he'd been farming for a number of years, and well, as the years went by, his eyesight got worse and worse to where he finally had to stop. And he was looking for something else to do, and so he hit upon repairing lawnmowers, and apparently was pretty good at it. He had a great shop in the backyard where he would just keep all of his tools and all of his parts for the lawnmowers, had workbenches back there that he would work on them and it was just an incredible setup because a blind man, as you know, cannot see. So everything has to be in order, from the tools to the parts, so that when he wants to reach for one, it's where it ought to be. I can remember him telling me that some of the wise guys in the neighborhood, some of his friends, would occasionally come by and switch his tools around just to see what he would do. And he thought it was a hilarious joke and made him put them back. But again, he was just a remarkable man. Well, he started inviting me over for coffee. He clearly felt sorry for a man that was so stupid as he would treat a lawnmower in the way that I did, and so he was going to help me out. So he got to where he would call just about every day to see if I wanted to come over for coffee. And finally we had to settle, I think, on Tuesdays and Thursdays when I would come over for an hour or two, and we'd just enjoy a cup of coffee or two and really enjoy visiting. Well, the first time I went over there for coffee, Kenneth poured the coffee himself. Now, Kenneth, get this picture in your mind. It's an older man, close to 80 years old. He's in a wheelchair. His clothes and his hands often are greasy, and he smoked a pipe. He smoked a cigar as well. I think the cigars he smoked, he probably paid about 3 cents a piece for. If he paid more than that, he got ripped off because they were foul-smelling cigars. And when he got through with smoking them down as far as he could, he would poke the end of it in his pipe and he would finish it off. And so, anyway, here he is, grease-stained, nicotine-stained hands, and he poured me a cup of coffee, as the gentleman that he was. And if you've ever seen blind man pour a cup of coffee, you'll understand. He stuck his finger just inside the cup rim near the top and would pour until he felt his finger getting burned, and that's when he knew that the cup of coffee was filled. Well, I looked at that, and from that moment on, I became a gentleman and offered to always pour our coffee after that, and he permitted me to do that. But again, we would just get together and have a cup of coffee. He was a simple man. He obviously didn't watch television, but he had a radio, and he enjoyed listening to that from time to time. But so often when I would come over, he was just sitting there quietly puffing on his pipe or his cigar, drinking a cup of coffee, deep in thought. And it was just always fun to go over there and just stop from the busy pace of life and just sit down with a kind man and visit. And he was an intelligent man. He had learned poetry when he was a kid that he had to memorize in school, and he would quote this poetry or he would quote this passage that he had read years ago. He had a very fine and sharp mind, and so he would always want to discuss the recent events, whether it was the things going on a national basis with politics or whether it was a local basis with different friends of his. He always told me, I'm the safest person in town to talk to because I'm not related to anybody, so you can talk to me about anybody. So anyway, we would get together and we would just solve all the world's problems about in the first half hour, and then for the next half hour, we'd create a new set of problems so that we'd have something to solve the next time I came over. I can remember one time he looked at me with that those blind eyes of his. He had a pair of sunglasses that he wore, and he said, "Rick, do you ever do dishes around the house? And does Carolyn ever let you do dishes?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I guess so." And then it dawned on me he was suggesting that maybe I start earning my keep. So from that point on, before I left his house after we had finished our coffee, I would wash the coffee pot out and the cups and make sure that they were taken care of, and I was doing a little bit of my part. I remember one time when he had the coffee perking. He had a little silver coffee pot, and electric coffee pot, and he would plug that in, and it would be going, and then when it was stopped, you'd hear it stop perking. And one time while we were just visiting, waiting for the coffee to get ready, he finally said, "I think the coffee's ready." And I said, "I thought I heard it stop percolating over there." And he said, "No, the little light came on." Well, of course, he couldn't see that, but Kenneth had a great sense of humor. He also had a mind's eye in which he could see things. I remember one time he asked me if I'd seen the new Chevrolet pickup, and I confessed I had not. And he said, "Those are the ugliest things I've ever seen in my entire life." Well, apparently somebody described one to him, and he wasn't that impressed with it. I remember one time coming over to Kenneth's house, and he had a bandage on his forehead. And I asked him what had happened. Well, he had a sheep. Now, picture this. Kenneth's property was, I don't know, maybe 120 feet deep and maybe 50 feet wide. And around the back part of that property, it was just ringed with lawnmowers, old lawnmower bodies. And they were just pushed up against the fence. But there was a sheep that he kept to munch the grass, to keep the grass down in that backyard, so it was always well groomed. And I always got tickled at that. It looked like with all those broken down lawnmowers ringing the fence and a sheep out there, it always looked like somebody that just was saying, "I give up, I can't keep a mower running, I'll use a sheep." But anyway, Kenneth always kept a sheep, and he had some really good friends. He had one friend by the name of Larry Simons who would come over and he would just take care of him in different ways. He would take him to the doctor sometimes, and I think gave him his Saturday night bath. And he had another friend by the name of Kirk Williams who would do all this grocery shopping for him. And so when I moved to town, I helped him with his bills, and I would just write out the bills. But anyway, he had that bandage on his forehead. And I'd ask him what had happened, and he said, well, he was bending over to feed sheepy, and that old sheep headbutted him, knocked him down, nearly knocked him out. And I said, well, what did you do? And he said, well, he won't headbutt me anymore. And I said, well, what happened? He said, well, the next day I put Sheepy's food in his tray like I always do and got his water. And then when Sheepy came up, I grabbed him by the collar with one hand and I hit him over the head with a hammer in the other. And he said, he won't bother me anymore. And sure enough, Sheepy was pretty docile after that. But anyway, I think it was Larry that had bought him that sheep. It may have been Kirk Williams, but the neat thing was Kenneth really liked something unusual, so he could talk about it. And the sheep that he had at that point was just kind of an old mountain type sheep. It wasn't your regular run-of-the-mill domestic sheep. And he really enjoyed that sheep. Before that, he had gotten a black sheep. And so he always wanted something a little bit unusual just for a conversation piece, in addition to the fact that they were functional as well. Well, Kenneth, as the years went by, I knew him for about 5 years, he just got a little bit more and more frail. I think it was earlier in the year I moved to Happy, that he had fallen and broken his hip. And he said he never did figure out if his hip broke and caused him to fall, or if he fell and his hip broke. But whatever it was, he had a broken hip and a broken leg. And so he was wheelchair bound most of the time, though he could use a walker. And Kenneth would go down the steps of his back porch on his walker, and take him forever to do that. And then he would get to his clothesline, and he would put his walker to the side, and he would just kind of grab a hold of that clothesline with one hand, and he'd just walk to the end of it, and then turn around and grab it with the other hand and walk to the end of that, and was getting his strength back in that leg. He also had an exercise bike that I just thought was the neatest thing. Well, they got him an odometer for that exercise bike. So between the two of us, we figured out how many miles he would have to ride to go to Canada and back. And so we got all that figured out and got a map out for me to keep track of. And he would ride his bike, and I would come over and I would see how many miles he had ridden since the last time I'd been there, and we'd write it down in his little notebook, and we'd figure out how far he had gone on his bicycle. I think he probably made it to about Kansas or a little bit farther north than that, when he finally just played out and he couldn't exercise much anymore. I remember one time when we were sitting there visiting and his phone rang. He always carried his phone in his pocket. It was one of those that had the receiver base that was connected to the wall. And so he picked it up, and I heard him say, "No, I'm not interested." And Kenneth was always very polite to people, and he told him again, "No, I'm not interested." And then finally he just sat straight up and he said, "Hey, you wait just a minute." He said, "I'm in a wheelchair. I've got 2 hearing aids in, and I'm blind in both eyes. Don't you tell me what to do and not to do." And he hung up on him. And I asked him what all that was about. Well, it was a veteran, or somebody that said they were representing the veterans, I think is what it was. And they were selling light bulbs to help the handicapped. And Kenneth couldn't really help a lot at that time, so he didn't help them. And so the man that he was talking to said, "Don't you care about the handicapped?" And that was what initiated that conversation. And Kenneth put him in his place. Well, about the year 2000, Kenneth got to the point where he just had to go in to the hospital for a bit to get his feet taken care of. And there was a lady in town by the name of Goldie Aaron that would look in on him, and she would take him to the doctor. And finally the doctor just said he's going to have to stay here. And so he stayed in a nursing facility probably for a month or two. And finally they felt like they had done all they could, and they sent him back home, where they put him on hospice, and just his friends, Larry Simons and Kirk Williams and Goldie, would look in on him. And every once in a while I would come and take a shift, but they were with him until the end, until he passed. The thing that I wanted to talk about Kenneth today, though, was how remarkable of a man that he was. He had what most of us would consider to be insurmountable obstacles. Just having one or two of his ailments, especially being blind, We might just be tempted at that point to just give up, to move into a facility and let somebody take care of us. But that wasn't Kenneth. Kenneth had an absolute determination that he was going to live alone, that he was going to take care of himself, and in those few areas that he couldn't take care of on his own, he had friends, and good friends, who would look after him and take care of him. But Kenneth Wood, probably as much as any person I've ever known, taught me about the importance of overcoming your obstacles, the importance about having enough inner strength to just get on and take care of what needed to be taken care of without complaining and whining about it. And I really, other than that one phone call where he let the guy know what his situation was, I really never heard Kenneth talk about his situation. As a matter of fact, I pretty much forgot that Kenneth was blind as far as our relationships. Obviously, I knew that he was, but one day the power went out in Happy, and so all the electricity was off in town, and I went over to check on Kenneth, and Kenneth was just sitting in the dark, puffing on his pipe, in his chair, didn't have his cup of coffee because he couldn't heat it up, but it just struck me for the first time what his life must have been like, just to a small degree, to always be in the dark. Because for him, that was nothing. It was nothing out of the ordinary. So the power going out didn't really affect him. He still had gas heat in his house, and so he still had heat. And he was fine, other than the fact that he didn't have his cup of coffee. And it made me think about what a remarkable human being Kenneth was, that he was able to overcome adversity, to not just survive, but to literally thrive in life, to have a community that loved him, that for years came to him and so that he could repair their lawnmowers, and he did a good enough job to where he earned their business. And when he stopped repairing lawnmowers, it left a hole in Happy to where people had to go somewhere else and take it to people who weren't quite as capable as he was. Well, it's this ability to overcome obstacles that Christians need. There's a passage found in 1 John chapter 5, and it says in verse 3, "This is love for God, to obey his commands, and his commands are not burdensome. For everyone born of God overcomes the world. This is the victory that has overcome the world, even our faith. Who is it that overcomes the world? Only he who believes that Jesus is the Son of God." And so we are told as believers that we are to overcome the world, that with God's help, God helps us to overcome the world. And yet, there's a lot of times where we let the world overcome us. We yield to temptation. Somebody makes us mad, and we just lash out, or we're something happens to us, and we use foul language in our complaints, or we just complain and whine over every little thing that doesn't go our way, or we look at things at the movies or on television or the internet that we shouldn't be looking at, but the world has come into our view and we allow it to overcome us. Whatever the situation is, we all know that we have struggles with being overcome by the world, and we are told that everyone that is born of God will overcome the world. In Revelation, difficult book to understand, but when you look at Revelation chapter 2 and 3, there's really not a lot within that is too difficult for us. It's Jesus' messages to 7 churches in Asia. And with each one of these churches, he starts talking to them about the things that they are doing well. And he also, to the ones that are not doing well in areas, he tells them, you've got to repent of this. And then he ends up by reminding them, you're strong here, you just need to do better here. And in each instruction for each one of these 7 churches, he talks about to him who overcomes, and then he tells a promise that will be available for them. And that promise, though worded differently in prophetic language, essentially is the same, there will be heaven for those who overcome. And that was his encouragement to each one. That was his nearly his final instruction to each one as he would talk about these various churches. To Smyrna, he wrote to them, and he talked about the fact that if they would overcome, that he would give them a crown of life. And that's really what we're here for when you think about it. This life comes with a lot of challenges. Sometimes we don't handle those challenges well, and we need to repent when that happens. But every once in a while, we'll run into somebody who does remarkably well with the challenges that they have, that is worth copying and emulating and trying to pattern our life after what they're doing good. We obviously have Jesus, who did everything perfect, and if we can pattern our life after him, then we're going to overcome everything that comes our way. But we also have people, human beings, friends in our lives that we can observe for a time, and we can admire how they are able to overcome the different struggles that they have and to do well, to not just get through them, but to absolutely do extremely well on getting through their trials. Kenneth Wood was such a man, and it calls to my mind the very types of things that Christ instructs us to do, that God encourages us to do. There will be difficult times in this life, and there will be times that these difficulties will cause us almost to go to our knees because they're so difficult. But we're promised, if we will overcome, that someday we'll inherit a crown of life and we'll be with God forever. If we can do that, if we can learn the lessons of the Kenneth Woods of this world, and learn to pattern ourselves after the perfect pattern that God has within Scripture, we're going to overcome. We can't do it on our own. Kenneth could not survive without his friends. If it hadn't been for men like Kirk and Larry, if it hadn't been for women like Goldie, he would have had to have gone into a nursing facility. But the neat thing about Kenneth was he did everything he could, and those things he could not, he allowed someone else to help him in. We need to be doing that for others as well, but we also need to realize in our own lives that there will be times where we can handle a lot, but we're going to need God to take care of the rest. And isn't it wonderful, isn't it beautiful to know that he will do that for us? Sometimes he does it in the form of our friends, by allowing them to help us. And sometimes he just helps us in ways that perhaps we'll never know about. But with God's help, if we'll be determined to serve him in his way and to truly serve Jesus as our Savior, we can overcome any obstacle. Kenneth was able to overcome the obstacle of being crippled and nearly deaf and blind. Surely you and I can overcome the obstacles that we have in life in order to serve God to the best of our ability. Well, that's all I have for today. I hope this helped. If it was something that did help you, if you like these types of videos, be sure and subscribe. Share them with others if you think that they might enjoy it as well. But until next time, I pray that God will richly bless you as you seek to serve him to the best of your ability and as you do your very best to overcome any obstacles that may come your way.